Hey, you're watching Impossible Color, and today I'm going to do another live edit. Feel free to jump into the chat and you can ask any questions that you want in there, and I'll do my best to help you out as I work through this photo today. So I'm going to be starting things off in Adobe Camera Raw, and you can see that the photo I have today is really dark. And I can't remember why I shot it so dark, but I'm guessing that it has something to do with these unusually raw, bright lights that were back here. And I probably wanted a lot of room to work with, or perhaps I just shot it and I forgot what my settings were. But either way, we can definitely salvage this photo, and I think it's going to look pretty good by the end of it. So I'm going to go in and set my camera profile to neutral. I don't want Adobe guessing at what I want my photo to look like. I want to decide that for myself. So normally I don't adjust exposure off the bat, but because this is so underexposed, that I'm just going to crank that right up. Just kind of give us a base to start with. And this is the beauty of working with Camera Raw, is you can adjust the exposure at any time. So even though this photo looked like it was underexposed, I still have all that information there to reclaim it. So now I want to adjust the white balance, kind of account for those lights in there. Get a little bit more towards this blue side here. I think somewhere around there looks pretty good. And for the tint, just edge that up a tiny bit. I'd like to get the whites brought up as well. It's quite dark in some areas. But then I'm losing some definition in other areas, so I want to bring those shadows down a tad. And the blacks as well. And that's looking pretty good to me. Now I want to soften things up a little bit by bringing the clarity down. Like this, because this is a pre-wedding photo, I want it to have a little bit of a dreamy feel. You never want to go too extreme with clarity, or you get this really artificial look in either direction. So that looks a lot better to me so far. Now let's move on to the HSL. You notice that I often skip the tone curve in here. I find that a lot of it is generally covered in this, but once in a while I'll go in here and I'll tweak these values. But I generally use this more for if I want to do special RGB channel adjustments. So anyone who's just joined the channel, please feel free to jump into the chat. And now is your opportunity to ask any questions that you want as I'm working. So let's have a look at each individual color. I'm going to bring those reds down towards the more pinky side. And I find that it makes the makeup look a little bit nicer here. I'm going to warm up the orange a little bit more towards the red slightly. And I'm going to bring the yellows over too, just so there's no green hints in the coming through in the skin. Leave my greens as is. I like the look of that. Tweak those aquas up a tiny bit. Blues look good as is. And I'm going to turn up the purples a little bit towards the right. Gives kind of a complementary feel with the greens of the sari here. And magentas I'll leave as is. I always prefer to do my saturation per color channel, because I find that some colors, they just take saturation quite a bit different than others. It doesn't take a lot to get that red and green, and depending on the image, it can have a dramatic effect. Even if you decide to desaturate your image in the end, or bring down the saturation just a little bit, it's a good idea to adjust your saturation per color, because each one is relative to each other, even if you bring down the global saturation. It's that relationship that matters. Bringing up the saturation of that purple just gives a little bit more life to the background there. Just get kind of a dulled out gray. Now you got to be really careful when you crank up your magentas, because you pick up little lens artifacts, and it can cause a lot of weird patterns and things. And now for the luminance. Let's fit the view here. Brighten up those reds just a bit. You can see in the lips and some of the makeup and the nails. They just pop out a little bit more when I'm lightening that up. And the oranges make the skin glow. And same thing with a little bit of yellow. Now you always want to make sure you look at the relationship between your reds, oranges, and yellows. Depending on what your subject's skin tones are, if those numbers go stray too far apart from one another, you can get some weird banding between the colors, much like what we saw with the magenta a little while ago. Going to bring the green down a little bit for contrast. Likewise with the aqua. So you can see on this cheek area here what the effects of going too dark with your magenta or too light. You get that banding separation of colors there. So I'm going to try to find a sweet spot somewhere around there. And that looks good for the luminance value. I always like to check the lens profile corrections to see if it can account for any distortions of the lens that I'm using. You can see it gives the values of the lens. I'm using an 85 millimeter 1.4 G. And it seems to be correcting a bit of this vignetting in the corners. And it's also stretching out the body a little bit. So I'm going to run with that this time. And now for the chromatic aberration. Let's have a look in here, see if we have any strange green and purple outlines that always seem to plague my images, especially when I have a filter on. And I seem to be lucky with this one. Probably the angle of light was pretty good. And I didn't get any strange outlines. And I'm going to just take a snapshot of this in case I ever want to edit it later. I can jump back to this. And now I'm just going to have a look at my cropping, see if there's anything I want to adjust here. I think I want to go just slightly tighter into the frame. Some people may feel like they want to crop out a light like this, but I think for this particular image it adds a kind of a glamour to it for her special day. Maybe I'll just go in a little bit tighter though. Seems to be some unnecessary detail on the edge. I want to give a little bit more room above the head, just some breathing room. You know, it's nice to crop in tight, but you have to make sure your image can breathe. And let's open that up. Actually, we'll save another snapshot and open that up in Photoshop. So if you're watching this, please jump into the chat and ask any questions that you like. So now for the Photoshop portion. The first thing that I'm going to do in here is a little bit of frequency separation. Now I do have a action for this. And in case you didn't know, if you ever want to duplicate a layer, you don't have to right click it and duplicate. You can just drag your layer down to the new layer button here, and it makes it pretty quickly for you. Now, for my frequency separation, I already have an action called skin, and this just sets it up for me, and what it does is it creates a low layer for frequency separation and a high. If I want to record that action again, I should probably have it rename these layers. It'd be a little easier, especially if you're new to working with them. So basically on the low layer, it's creating kind of a blurry low frequency, and on the high layer, you can see it's getting all the fine details for a high frequency. So on the low, I'm going to get in here and see if I can move my microphone. And I'm going to start blurring large expanses of skin. And just by going with Gaussian blur. Just give a little bit more feather to that. We don't want any hint of edges on this. So basically I'm just trying to smooth out the colors and the tones of the skin as I go, grabbing little segments and blurring it a little bit. And I'm using Control F. It's just applying my my blur over and over again. If you want to, you could use the paintbrush for this, like set to a soft brush. That's another technique that some people like to use. I kind of alternate between the two. I find with the brush, you can make accidents a little easier. So basically I'm trying to reduce any harshness in the skin here. Don't just focus on the face. Adding softness to the hands is really nice as well. So you don't want to see, I keep selecting a small amount that doesn't actually have any pixels. That's what that little error is. You don't want to have those knuckles too harsh, especially if it's a woman. I was stuck with a pretty tricky lighting situation for this image, so it's important to recover in post-processing. So you can see that one of these knuckles is quite a bit more pink than the rest of them. So in this case, I'm going to use my brush. And I'm going to select some of the color over here and just fix that up. You can see that blends in a lot better with the other knuckles and doesn't stand out so awkwardly. Same thing up here. We've got a bit of kind of purple on the knuckles. And that looks like a good first pass on my low frequency. So let's have a look at the high frequency. Now this is not what the model really looks like. It's creating unnatural exaggerations in the skin, but it's just a tool to help us as we work through this. So we'll get rid of a few little imperfections in the skin here so we get it nice and smooth. So we've already covered the large areas of variation, and now we're onto these really fine areas. These knuckles are just a bit too prominent here with this lighting, so there's no need to draw too much attention to them. And her arms are very smooth, so there's not really a lot to work on here. Now you don't want to remove all of the pores of the skin or it'll look very unnatural. And a lot of people that retouch skin give a kind of an artificial look. It can look very plasticky, and that's not what you want. You definitely don't want to just go and blur the whole skin and leave everything else sharp, or it's going to look like a Barbie doll. So let's have a look at what those two look like together. And a much smoother skin. Let's just turn that on and off so you can see the difference. Zoom in there a little bit. The before and after. Much improved. I'm going to go back to the low and just do a little bit more blurring. This time I'm going to use the blur tool. Now remember that this isn't like blurring just on your raw image, because we're still getting the details coming through on this high layer. So when we separate them, we have that advantage. Thanks for checking out Total Rock 508. Feel free to ask questions, man. And we'll do another pass on the high frequency as well. And that looks good to me. Let's have a look at the skin before and after again. And nice. Okay, so now that the skin's done, I'm going to work on some color. So we'll go down here and we'll do an adjustment layer. First off, we'll go to color balance. So the color balance, I could close this, turn it on and off. It's not going to affect anything that's underneath. That's the beauty of these adjustment layers. So we'll start with the shadows. Play around with some different values here. Add a little bit more purple to those shadows. And now for the midtones. very subtle at this point. And the highlights. So before and after, you can see a bit more depth and interest with the colors here, especially with the background. You're seeing more definition and contrast in the dress, particularly around this area. And the blacks just look better overall everywhere. So now I'm going to go down to make another adjustment layer, but this time will be selective color. And I'm going to be going through each color individually. If you want to jump to a particular color, just drop down there. Now I'd like to say there's a magic formula for doing this, but really it's a feel thing. You have to just practice at it as much as you can and get an idea of what kind of colors you like to work with. And the greens. Cyans. If you are ever working on your image and you're zoomed in really close, you can also make another window, so you can look at a couple of them at the same time. So you go to Window, Arrange, and you could go to a new window here, and you can see that I have two of them. So let's say, for example, you wanted to see the big picture on one of them, but you're zoomed in like this. It's a great way of kind of keeping track of what you're doing. And onto the blues. It's nice to see the blues and purples in this image. It provides a nice contrast for the warmth of the skin. And by darkening those cooler values a bit, it also helps the contrast as well. I think I liked the way the background was working, but it adjusted the lips more than I wanted to. I could isolate that later if I wanted to. I'm not going to adjust the whites, neutrals, and blacks because I covered most of that in the color balance already. So let's have a look at the before and after of the selective color. So I think that really helps the skin pop out more. And I'm going to put those in a folder. You can just go, let me show you again, a new group from layer. So any layers they have selected will go right into a group. And we'll just call that color. And let's look at the big picture. Much improved. So the only thing that I have left to do here is we're going to get a little bit of noise reduction. Because this was taken in a dark room, the ISO had to come up, and one of the artifacts of that is getting this noise in your image. But I'm going to use a pretty cool tool for dealing with that. But first of all, I'm going to flatten a copy of all those layers together. I'll go to Filter, and lately I've been using the Nick collection by Google. It's a free set of tools that you can use for sharpening and noise reduction and color effects, all kinds of things. But the main ones that I use is the noise reduction, which is called Define 2. And I find this does a much better job than the tools that come with Photoshop. So you can see as you slide here, there's quite a bit of noise is reduced. So I'm actually just going to run with the default. That's looking pretty good to me. And we're going to go right back into Filter. And our final step is going to be doing a high pass. Or I'm sorry, not a high pass. Sometimes I sharpen with a high pass, but today it's going to be going back into the Nick collection, and we'll be doing the output sharpener. Now it's really important to do the sharpening last, because if, for example, we didn't do that noise reduction, we'd have a lot more noise that would have been sharpened at this stage. Let's have a look around. See how this looks. And I'll set my layer blending to luminosity. And I'm going to put everything that I altered into a new group and just call this after, and the background. Oops, the background we'll call before. And this is our before and after completed image. The reason that I do luminosity is because sometimes when you're using the sharpening tool, it it affects the saturation of the colors and the transitions between the lights and darks, and it can kind of create some funky colors. It's not always that bad, but sometimes it shows up pretty bad, and by setting to luminosity, you're working only with the tones. So that is the final image, before and after. Thanks for checking out Impossible Color. If you have any questions about everything that I did today, now's a good time to ask away in the chat. I hope that answered your question okay. Fat Space Panda, thanks for checking out the show. Also, I wanted to ask, was the volume pretty good for the show today? Were you able to hear everything okay? Cool. Fat Space Panda says the volume was perfect. So I usually actually have some music going in the background, so I just forgot to turn that on today. But next time I'll do that. Give a little bit more interest when I'm quiet. So that's it for the show today. Thanks for checking us out. Total Rock 508, Fat Space Panda, and whoever else was creeping in the background as I was editing this. Check in sometime tomorrow, and I'll be editing another video tutorial for you. Thanks for checking out Impossible Color. We'll see you later.